Lyndon Johnson was not the only beneficiary from the death of John F. Kennedy, who would occupy the highest office in our nation. Others included Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, George Herbert Walker Bush, and someone else who never would have been taken seriously but for his father's occupancy of that office, namely George W. Bush. While George H.W. Bush, I believe, was no supporter of John F. Kennedy, his role appears to have been as boots on the ground in Dealey Plaza, where I'm very pleased to have perhaps the world's leading expert on George H.W. Bush as our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming John Hankey. I'm pulling it up.
Well, and in the meantime, we're going to wait for this thing to come up. And I'll tell you, I'll just describe the first slide. Yes?
We're stuck on a cancellation.
You know, well, we've done this before. It just takes a while, right? It has to think about it for a while. The first slide, I don't know, from your youth, from my youth, I remember there was a poem called The Blind Men and the Elephant. Any people in here remember that? And let me summarize it for those who don't, which is you got 8 blind men, and they're all looking at the elephant, and one's touching the tusks and says, oh, the elephants are, they're long and hard and spiky and whatnot. And one grabs the trunk and says, oh, geez, elephants are like a snake. And one grabs the ear and says, geez, elephants are flat and, practically like a piece of paper. And somebody grabs the tail and on and on and on. And the Kennedy assassination is like that. It is this giant expanse of subjects that it is so difficult to get a handle on any one of them, and much less all of them. But I think that you can't have a really good understanding of what the elephant is that we're talking about, what the nature of the Kennedy assassination that we're talking about, if you don't have a very, very broad approach to it. And if I had the picture, I would say Ralph is the guy examining Oswald in the doorway, and Joan Mellon is the guy examining Garrison, and other people are examining. Phil is looking at Lyndon Johnson, and I'm looking at George Bush. I was going to say I'm the guy in the back who's got the cute butt, but it's not up on the screen, so what am I going to do? You'd have laughed if you'd saw the picture anyway. But it's important. Now, Jim Mars made this point that he was talking about circumstantial evidence and the importance of circumstantial evidence, because you can forge a document and you can alter a photograph and you can send in a witness and have them lie, but you can't forge the circumstances, right? I mean, the Vietnam War and the things that happened in the Vietnam War are the circumstances, and the campaign for presidency, or, and on and on and on. But that if you have a very, very broad approach, that when you take a broad approach, it allows you to take a document and decide whether or not you think it's forged, right? Because if the document you have in your hand contradicts all of the contradicts all of the circumstantial evidence, then either the circumstantial evidence is false or the document is false, but it reveals those sort of conflicts. And given how much misinformation there is in the Kennedy assassination, right? How many forged documents and altered photographs and lying witnesses, that sort of approach is fabulously important.
We're going to have to restart it. It's stuck.
Okay.
Just keep talking.
Well, let's see. Where was I going next? I'm sorry? Hang on. Yeah, broad strokes and it's this point. Speaking of, it's something that I wrote down in my notes, and I wasn't really going to present it in the talk. And the next slide is a picture of Plato's cave. Anybody in here familiar with Plato's cave? And, all right, well, here we go, right? You guys are sitting there, and you've got your hands chained behind your backs, and you're locked into the chair, and you can't look anywhere but this direction. And in those days, they didn't have projectors. Well, but they do in this story. There's a projector, and there's a fire in the back of the room, and then the enlightened ones stand in front of the fire and project shadows onto the wall. And we are the people who sit there and look at the shadows and try to figure out what it is that we're looking at, and we believe what we see. And so if you hold a puppet up in front of the fire and you move the puppet around, and it's just a puppet, but the person sitting in the audience doesn't know that it's a puppet, to them it's a real creature. It's a real being with its own spirit and its own motivations and so on. And there's a number of important lessons from that particular circumstance, and one of them is that there is a group that Plato called, I mean, if you put it into Latin, they're the Illuminati. And we are not those guys. We are not the Illuminati. We're the idiots sitting in the audience watching what they project on the screen, and it's very, very, very difficult for us to not get fooled, given the enormous power that they have to shape our perceptions, and given our very, very limited ability to ascertain what the hell is really going on. And let me give you just a for example. We're still waiting, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. JFK approved the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, right? Everybody knows that. Since I wasn't going to tell this story, but, you know, I'm killing time, so let me kill some time. When the Bay of Pigs occurred, Kennedy said, what the hell happened? And he called Maxwell Taylor out of retirement. And the reason he called Maxwell Taylor out of retirement was because he wanted somebody leading the investigation who outranked anybody who might be questioned. And I think Maxwell Taylor had 5 stars, and there wasn't anybody else on the planet who had more stars than he. So that if he called somebody in, they had to answer the question. They couldn't refuse to answer the question, because if they had orders not to cooperate or to tell some story that wasn't the truth, they had orders from somebody with an inferior rank. So that was the idea, and Maxwell Taylor came out, and geez, how long did it take him to do the 9/11 investigation? I think he was done in about 3 weeks. And they called all of these guys in, all of these CIA guys in, and some of it is just really stunning, where the CIA guy is sitting there and Dulles is across the table. And Maxwell Taylor is asking him the question, and he looks at Dulles and he looks at Maxwell Taylor, and then he answers the question. And there's some real drama going on there. One of the things that says is that they proposed the Bay of Pigs assassination to John Kennedy, and he looked at it and he said, no D-Day style invasions. He rejected it. It's what it so happens is also contained in that document. The document is called Operation Zapata. It was published 25 years ago. That is, it was declassified and published by the U.S. government printing office 25 years ago. And if you look hard enough, you might be able to find it at your public library. It's for sale on Amazon for like $500. And if it were less, I would have bought it. Anyhow, I will try to get a copy. The LA Public Library has it, and it's on my to-do list to get a copy and post it on the internet so that people can review it. Google Books hasn't posted it.
Here we go.
Hey! See the guy bending over in the back with the cute butt? That's me, anyway. Okay, very good. Very good. Where were we? Kennedy told the CIA, you go back, no D-Day style invasion, you can smuggle some guerrillas in the dead of night, smuggle them in. Well, the notion that you would bomb the Air Force before you smuggle guys in the dead of night, that's ridiculous. But they did, and that's another thing, and I have the slide, but it's not in my presentation because I had to cut back the time so much. They bombed. It was a friend of mine, Paul Kangas in San Francisco, who was, to my mind, the first guy who really got serious about trying to blame the Kennedy assassination on George Bush, provided me with a number of slides, and one of them you'll see today that I hope will knock your socks off. Anyhow, he provided me with a slide of a photograph of the newspaper showing that they bombed Cuba. The notion that the bombings were canceled is it's sort of silly. on the one hand, and the other thing is that Kennedy didn't know that they were going to bomb Cuba. This was some news to him. They weren't supposed to bomb Cuba, and they did, and the Cubans went to the United Nations, and they're screaming, and Adlai Stevenson is sitting there going, the Cubans are lying, and, you know, anyway. The Cubans were able to establish what was going on. I mentioned that I think it's great that Fetzer is able to invite a guy like me and who can stand up and disagree with people. I think that the circumstantial evidence suggests that Lyndon Johnson wasn't a mastermind of the Kennedy assassination and may very well not have been involved at all. And I'll present just a tiny little bit of stuff that isn't really on that topic, but although I think it touches on it, but it's more directed at other circumstances. Anyhow, this is us in the cave, and the other thing that the other lesson that I want people to get from this example is that we don't know. We're the idiots sitting in the audience, and for me to get vicious and criticize somebody because they disagree with me about what the shadows on the wall mean is pretty stupid on my part, and that we have to, we have to be patient with each other. I don't know why that's there, but we're reading shadows, and you can't do a good job reading shadows. None of us. We're doing the best that we can, but you have to be humble, and you have to be skeptical of your own position, and you have to be tolerant and patient and kind, and you have to study your ass off, because there's so much to know, and it's so easy to judge somebody when they're discussing something that you are not familiar with, and they are. Anyhow, I was going to try to walk us through my 40 years of investigating the Kennedy assassination, and it started when I was 20 years old, and a friend of mine, my best friend, had an illegal copy of the Zapruder film, and showed it to me, and I probably am not going to be able to get this to play. In fact, it was supposed to play when it came up on the screen, and of course it's not, and who cares? You all know what it shows, and despite the altered nature of the Zapruder film, it shows very clearly. You can't, I couldn't, right, at 20 years old, and a history student, I couldn't look at that and say, oh yeah, Kennedy was obviously shot from behind. No, he was very, very obviously shot from the front, and everything that I have ever been taught in my life, I should assume is a lie until I can verify it from other sources, more reliable sources, or from 20 different sources that hate each other and are saying the same things. Anyhow, we try to take that approach of you have to get other verification of what it is that you're looking at. But that was my starting point, was looking at the Zapruder film, and I very quickly progressed to Mark Lane and Dick Gregory running around saying that that middle photograph, the tramp, was E. Howard Hunt. The photograph that's supposed to knock your socks off is the one at the top. That's E. Howard Hunt practicing his sniping. You'll look a long time before you find that photograph. Paul Kangas supplied it to me and told me where I could find it. It's in Hunt's earliest autobiography. It's not in his subsequent autobiographies. Gee, I wonder why he removed it. But my friend Gary was telling me how they send signals and to us. Well, no, to the Illuminati. The Illuminati, the people who are in on it, send signals to each other. And Hunt there was no context for that photograph. He puts it in his autobiography, and there's no context for it. And except that his friends in the CIA reading it says, oh, there he is practicing shooting people from 50 feet away. I had this, so I thought I'd throw it up, and it's just for a second. But coup d'etat in America makes a big deal out of the notion that you can use ears as fingerprints, and that's the ear of the tramp, and it's the ear of Hunt, and they're very, 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 very similar. Anyhow, my next step in educating myself was reading Plausible Denial, and the notion that the CIA Jesus Angleton had written a memo to Richard Helms saying Hunt was in Dallas the day that Kennedy was assassinated and was involved in the operation, and there's that book, and I very, very highly recommend Plausible Denial. But so that was a huge step in my education. But by this time I was teaching my students. I had classes, and one of the things that I would teach them, I would show them this program on PBS called, a NOVA program called Who Shot President Kennedy, and just astonishing piece of propaganda in terms of them showing you the Zapruder film and persuading you that you didn't see what you saw, and showing you all of this other really, really powerful evidence and persuading you that you didn't see what you saw, and interviewing all of these Dallas doctors who described the fist-sized hole that Kennedy had in the back of his head, and persuading you that you didn't see what you saw. And I was happily doing that, right? And I felt like I was doing a good job teaching my kids, and they were learning a very, very valuable, important lesson about being distrustful and being critical thinkers and not accepting things at face value. And then John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. And I stopped being so happy. And I'm sitting there in a restaurant. My wife and I went to our favorite restaurant, and we ordered the food, and I looked up at the screen, and they showed these ships going back and forth on the water, and Kennedy's plane is still missing. And I had heard this early in the morning, and it had slipped my mind that he was missing. And I hadn't taken it as being that panicked of a situation. But I see the boats crisscrossing on the water, and when I see this guy's face come up on the screen, I couldn't eat my dinner. I'm not making that story up. I was literally sick to my stomach. My God, they killed him. Right? If that guy, right, I don't know if people are familiar, but I'll tell the story as quickly as I can. He was the only reporter for 25 years who was allowed to see the Zapruder film. All of these reporters were assembled in Dallas, and they heard that there was a moving picture that had been taken, a Super 8 of the assassination, and they demanded to see it, and the FBI said, no, you can't, and they said, you killed him. And the FBI said, oh, all right, that's not a good answer. So we're going to let one of you see it, and it was Dan Rather, and you can Google Dan Rather, and you can find it on the internet. Surprisingly simply, I haven't done it today, but I've done it recently. Him saying that you clearly see the president's head jerked forward. This is a videotape, and I could spend 20 minutes talking about what I had to go through to get this videotape, and of course it's not going to play. What are we going to do? I'm going to have to tell you that. This is a videotape from Boston. I think it's ABC in Boston. Maybe you can see the logo on the next. Is that a 5? Channel 5 in Boston. Todd Burgun, Chief Petty Officer, you can almost see it. Todd Burgun comes on the air of the radio station and says that John Kennedy contacted the tower at Martha's Vineyard Airport. He was 19 miles off the coast. He was 2,500 feet in the air, and it was at 9:49. Well, gee, if you have the patience of a knucklehead like me, I had to contact my congressman to get a copy of the NTSB report, right? They wouldn't send it. They're supposed to send it to you if you ask for it, and they didn't. But I contacted my congressman, and my congressman said, hey, give it to me, and he gave it to me. And in that report, they do a radar analysis that shows that Kennedy's plane was 19 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard at 2,500 feet at 9:49. Well, how did this guy Burgun know that that's where the plane was at that time? Because a minute before it was at 5,000 feet, and a minute later it was on its way streaking down into the water. So he hit it very precisely on the head. The point is very clearly Kennedy contacted the tower. And the problem is that if you are on final approach, if you contact the tower and tell them that you're on final approach, there's a number of things that happen. One of them is they give you a code that you put into a radar device on your plane called a transponder that then sends out a signal to the FAA telling them who you are and where you are and what your altitude is and also where you're headed. And if you descend, the head of the NTSB investigation explained to me that if you descend below 100 feet, anywhere but the target runway that you have told them that that's where you're going, it sets off an alarm at the FAA headquarters so that they know that you're in trouble and they can start a search looking for you. In addition to which, Kennedy had an emergency locator transmitter, it's called. It's crash activated. Both of those things, I had the head of the Coast Guard in California tell me that both of those will locate your crash to within 3 feet. How long do you suppose it took them to get search vessels to the crash area? I left out that if you say that you're on final approach, FAA regulations say they're supposed to start a search within 5 minutes. It took them 15 and a half hours. Edward Kennedy is on the phone screaming at these guys. He had to wake up Clinton to get a plane into the air, and when they put planes into the air, they scattered them all over the Atlantic, and they kept them away from Martha's Vineyard. What the hell's going on? Why would anybody want to kill John Kennedy Jr.? What sense does that make? I thought he was a stupid boob. And, I spent an enormous amount of time investigating him, and guess what? He wasn't a stupid boob. Well, unless you call it stupid for a member of the Kennedy assassination to publish an article by Oliver Stone in their magazine saying that Kennedy Sr. was murdered by elements of his own government, which is what Stone published in George magazine. John Kennedy Jr. printed that. he printed an article in his magazine about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who was in Dallas, by the way. Rabin's wife says he was in Dallas the day that Kennedy was murdered. She didn't know what he was doing there, and neither do I, and neither does anybody else, I don't suppose, but it's rather interesting that he was there. In any case, he was murdered, and the article written by the mother of the arrested and imprisoned assassin said that there was no way that kid could have fired the shot that he allegedly fired without the cooperation and participation of the security forces. They would have stopped him. Why didn't they stop him? Because he was a member, he was an asset of the Mossad, and it was all a setup. Well, that's what the mother said, and he published that. Well, you know, that reminds me of me saying, well, you can't fly a 747 into the Pentagon without anybody firing a shot unless it's a setup, right? It has to be a setup. All of the Cold War defenses are still in place. How did they do that? But I didn't really feel like so I had evidence that he was murdered, but I didn't really feel like I had evidence of why, or certainly who, right? All right, so they killed him because he published an article by Oliver Stone, and they killed him because he published this thing about the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, but who would want to kill him? Who? And, well, how do you approach that? And my approach was to say, well, let's make a safe assumption, a solid bet, that the people who killed his father were probably involved in the murder of the son. And so where do you start? Well, the only place I could start is the only handle that I had on the Kennedy assassination that I knew of, which was that I got from Out of Plausible Denial, which was that Hunt had done it. So, all right, who's connected to Hunt? Who can we connect to Hunt? So Mark Lane was under the influence of Fletcher Prouty. And after Prouty died, Mark Lane wrote another book in which he left out all of this fabulous stuff that Prouty forced him, I think, to publish, which was, first of all, this memo from J. Edgar Hoover that, right, J. Edgar Hoover, assassination of President Kennedy, that names George Bush. Now, there's some screwy stuff that Prouty, I think, also made him publish, which says that Bush named a plane during World War II after his wife. That plane got shot down. He named his next plane after his wife. And one of the ships at the Bay of Pigs was named the Barbara. And that's supposed to be proof. Another one of the ships was named the Houston. And what kind of screwy proof is that? Well, it's screwy. But if Mark Lane said it, I'm going to feel like I should quote it. And in fact, it turns out that Mark Lane got it from Fletcher Prouty. And then there's this other nonsense about how Bush's oil company was named Zapata Oil, and as I mentioned earlier, the Bay of Pigs operation, the code name was Operation Zapata, which is what that report from the Maxwell Taylor report is called. And, so, all right, that's not very good, but it's what we got. Certainly that stuff about the ships and so on. But why would George Herbert Walker Bush want to kill John Kennedy? I don't get it. I didn't get it. I don't get it. Well, no, I'm sorry. Hang on. If you want to examine the elephant that is George Herbert Walker Bush, right, if you want to get the giant picture, I can't recommend anything more than Webster Tarpley's The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush. It's really, everything that you're going to see in the next 20 minutes is going to have come from him. And when in investigating that, what you find out is that the Bush family were thugs for the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller instrument is the Council on Foreign Relations. And when I say Council on Foreign Relations, I don't mean everybody who shows up at the meetings. I mean the dozen or so people who sit down in the Holy of Holies of the Council of Foreign Relations, right? The guys who are admitted to the innermost circle. Anyway, you read that book and you find out that Bush ran for Senate and lost, and they picked him up and dusted him off and gave him a congressional seat, and he ran for Senate again and lost, and they picked him up and dusted him off, and that's Prescott Bush. That's George Herbert Walker Bush's father. Damn, this is a powerful, powerful, powerful snake. I think that he dwarfs the evil of his two sons. And I don't have time to go into that, and I won't, but he forces Nixon to take Bush into the White House, and Nixon goes into the White House trailing E. Howard Hunt behind him. Nobody on the White House staff knew E. Howard Hunt except for George Herbert Walker Bush, who, although he came into the White House as the Secretary for the United Nations, he insisted on having a White House office so that he could communicate with Hunt. Well, I made up that last part. And then they forced Reagan, well, he ran against Reagan and lost. You know, he's not a likable guy, and he wasn't able to win the nomination against Reagan, but they forced Reagan to take him on, at least so says Tarpley. And so the conclusion then is that, I don't know if people are familiar with the Mafia in here, but I learned this from a killer, that if you want to sit down at the table with the Mafia, you have to commit a murder. They can't trust you. They can't relax. They can't sit there and talk about the extortion and the murders and the other crimes that they're going to be committing in front of you if they can't feel like they can absolutely trust you. And the only way they can absolutely trust you is if you commit a murder for them. And then they can trust you because they have as much on you as you will ever have on them. So that's rather my thesis. And I'll give you that that's a shadow on the wall. Me saying that George Herbert Walker Bush earned his place at the table with the Rockefellers by participating in a very, very, very forward fashion in the murder of John Kennedy. That's reading the shadows on the wall, and you know, I'm very, very, very open to criticism on that, and I have no right to get angry at anybody who suggests that that may not be an adept conclusion to have drawn. But does that answer the question for us? I mean, all right, so he's a member of this sick, twisted, murderous mafia. Oh man, is that going to get him? How is that going to motivate George Bush Sr. to kill John Kennedy Jr.? I didn't see it. This is supposed to be a video, and we're not going to get it to play. And so that's the Last Supper. Oh, man, that's terrible. Over on the far left is Cheney, and he's holding the leg of a baby. There's a baby in the middle of the table. And I think he's talking about let's do 9/11. And, yeah, certainly that's what Cheney is saying. Kissinger is sitting in the middle, and Kissinger is saying, yeah, we'll do it on September 11th because that's the day I overthrew the government in Chile and killed, 60,000 Chilean people in favor of democracy. What's his name? Giuliani, isn't that his name? Is next to Kissinger, and he's saying, yeah, and we'll kill all those goddamn firemen, who he hated, right? He was at war with the firemen union the whole time he was in. And the Rockefellers are all saying, baby. We're going to eat baby, and Bush on the far end is saying, hey, Cheney, pass the baby. All right. All right, geez, okay. Well, except that Cheney's cut out and Bush is cut out. And this turns green, and that is, Kissinger turns green, and he says, the father, the son. The father killed the father. The son should kill the son. The father killed the father. The son should kill the son. Kissinger said that to me at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was sound asleep, and I jumped up and said, what? If the father killed the father and the son killed the son, where the hell was George Jr.? This is 4 o'clock in the morning. I run over to my computer to look up where was George Jr. on July 19, 1999, the day that John Kennedy died. That's Karen Hughes, the head of the Bush campaign. And the reporters all ran to the Bush headquarters. They also ran to the Gore headquarters. This was the height of the election. And they said, hey, Gore, what do you think about this? And Gore said, I'm going to cancel all my appearances. And they ran to the Bush headquarters, and they said, hey, Bush, wait a minute, where's Bush? And Karen Hughes said, I don't know. And they said, well, when's he going to get back? And she said, I don't know. Damn, he was behind in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire election was 2 months away, and he disappears for an entire weekend. 3 days, he is absolutely, completely unaccounted for. Well, here's a little sidelight. The Sacramento Bee published an article saying that he'd been seen partying at the Bohemian Grove in California, and Karen Hughes called up the Sacramento Bee and demanded that they retract the story. And the reporter, I spoke to the reporter, and she said, yeah, Karen Hughes was, really angry and saying, oh, you got to retract that. And the reporter said, well, I have sources, and they're good, solid sources, but you tell me where George Bush was, and I'll retract the story. And you know what Karen Hughes said? Nothing. By to me, that's a little less shadowy than it was a few minutes ago. There's something going on. There's something going on with Bush and that weekend that the Bush campaign wasn't willing to talk about. Let me look at my notes for a second. All right, but still, that's not a very good case to make against Bush Jr., I don't think. Oh, you don't know where he was, well, and that's your case against him. Not very good. So I thought that, well, you certainly can't make that case unless you can make a rock-solid case about the shadow on the wall, that this guy earned his place at the table by killing the father. If you can make that rock solid, well, then you have a chance of making the case against George Jr. And as I said earlier, there's the memo, right, written by J. Edgar Hoover about a meeting that took place the day after the assassination. Damn. In which they called in George Herbert Walker Bush. What are we looking at? Right, it's written by J. Edgar Hoover himself, and it's not entitled, oh, you know, meaningless conversation I had with some guy who didn't have anything to do with anything. The title of the memo is Assassination of John F. Kennedy. And as I said before, it took place on November 23rd. Now, certainly, Jim will grant me that not everybody in the FBI was involved in the Kennedy assassination, and there were lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of guys in the FBI who were running around trying to find out the answer to who shot Kennedy. And on the 23rd, I'm sorry, the next thing you're supposed to notice is that it says misguided anti-Castro group. The Hoover memo says that they were investigating a charge by the State Department that some misguided anti-Castro group was going to use the Kennedy assassination as an excuse to invade Cuba. Well, if you read Jim Douglas's book, that's absolutely the case. The anti-Castro Cubans in Florida and the Mafia were totally in. We're going to kill Kennedy, and when we do, we're going to blame it on the Russians, and then we're going to invade Cuba. And they were announcing it before the assassination took place. They were saying, in a couple of days, there's going to be some stuff goes down, and it's going to allow us to invade Cuba. Anyway, Hoover was investigating all of that stuff. James Douglas's book is just a fabulous book, but I mean, there's all of this evidence that Oswald was involved in several raids against CIA caches of weapons and material that the CIA was using for their terrorist raids against Cuba. Anyhow, when Hoover says misguided anti-Castro group, what he means is the CIA. What he means is Operation 40. What he means is E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, Marita Lorenz, and Jerry Hemmings. Well, guess what, boys and girls? They called in Frank Sturgis. He says the FBI called him in and said, hey, you were in Dallas. And, you know, they would have got you to shoot him, right? I mean, you're the best shot. You're the best guy. You're the guy they would have gone to, right? He says that that's what the FBI told him. And he said, yeah, right, I'm going to tell you I shot the president. I don't think so. They called Marita Lorenz in. And Marita Lorenz said, oh, yeah, you know, I was in this caravan, 2 station wagons full of these Operation 40 guys and guns and whatnot. We pulled into Dallas the day before the assassination. You want to know who was in the car? And the FBI said, no, we know. We know who was in the car. That's what the FBI told Marita Lorenz. And they called in George Bush the next day. I'm sorry, they called in George Bush before they called in Marita Lorenz. And they interviewed him, and Hoover wrote a memo not about it. Hoover wrote a memo. If Hoover had written a memo talking about what they asked George Bush, we would never have seen it. But he disguised it. He lied about it. He said, oh, yes. So we went, the State Department was worried the anti-Castro Cubans were going to try to invade. And so we had our guys in Miami talk to the anti-Castro Cubans, and they're all brokenhearted and just, you know, in tears of the murder of the president. They were partying. I mean, that's documented as well. So the memo is disguised, and then way, way down at the bottom, it's got this line about the foregoing was reported to Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency. God damn. That's pretty good. I mean, if you're trying to pin the Kennedy assassination on George Bush, that's some pretty solid stuff. Now, let me look at my note for a second. What am I supposed to say at 54? Oh, why does it say that? I don't know why those 2 things are there. It doesn't make sense to me. The point is that everybody seems to have missed that the title of the assassination, right? The Nation magazine published the thing. Oh, I'm sorry, that's what it was. When Nation magazine published this article, it got a lot of attention because Bush had run for Senate, he had been elected to Congress, and he had run for Senate, and he never told anybody that he was in the CIA. And you're not supposed to do that. It's against the law, as a matter of fact. And Frank Church said, yeah, you know, and I always wondered how the hell he got appointed head of the CIA with no intelligence background. So, yes, this totally makes sense to me, right? Frank Church discussed this memo that was published in the Nation magazine, but it seemed like everybody missed what the title of the memo was. Everybody missed it except Fletcher Prouty, who forced Mark Lane to put it in a book about the Kennedy assassination. But Mark Lane seems to have missed it because he never put it in another book. But damn, you know, Bush's a young guy. He's a young father. What's he doing getting up to this, getting himself involved in this kind of stuff, right? He's a mild, this is what it says in my notes, a mild-mannered independent oil operator from Houston, right? And the day that they call in Sturgis and the day that they call in Lorenz and question them, I'm sorry, no. They called in Bush the next day. Sturgis and Lorenz, they took more time getting around to. And they write it up in a memo called Assassination of President John Kennedy. Well, that's pretty stiff stuff. And I don't remember that they asked Lorenz where she was. I think that they told Lorenz that they knew where she was. She volunteered it, but they knew. Well, you know what? They also knew where Bush was, because the Dallas Morning News had published that he was in Dallas the night before speaking to, and I have to ask you to pay particular attention to, the American Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors. 6:30 p.m. Thursday, Sheraton Dallas Hotel, George Bush, president of Zapata Offshore Company. They knew where he was. They knew that he was in Dallas. What's just extraordinary is that when, it'll come up, and I didn't mean to say it here, but I'm gonna, there's another memo written by the FBI in which George Bush, 45 minutes after the assassination, calls up the FBI and says, I think you should know this guy Parrott was threatening to kill the president. Just a bizarre phone call. And he says, you can meet me, you can find me tonight at the Sheraton Hotel. Damn, I lost it. Oh well. Let me look at my notes. I practiced this with my notes in hand, not without my notes out of hand. Okay, I'm sorry. They asked him about that Parrott memo, and he said, I don't remember. And people said, the reporter said, well, so where were you that day? Right? According to this Parrott memo that we're not looking at, it'll come up later. According to this Parrott memo that we're not looking at, you were in, whatever. And he says, oh, you don't remember? And he says, no, I was somewhere in Texas. Well, he wasn't somewhere in Texas. We have Dallas Morning News. He was in freaking Dallas the night before. In the Parrott memo, he says he's going to be in Dallas the night of. That's liable to be coming up. Oh, I'm sorry. In any case. So this is where I'm at in my investigation. I'm walking you through with me, right? We're taking this walk together this time. So I encounter that memo and I give it a good going over. And Bush says, oh, well, that memo might be incriminating for some other George Bush, but it wasn't me because I wasn't in the CIA. It's not me in the memo, and it's not me. And so let's ask the question then. Could it be true? Could that memo possibly be referring to another George Bush? And the Nation magazine found another guy named George Bush who said, who worked at the CIA, who said, I'm a low-level map reader. I didn't have any. Why would the FBI call me in? It wasn't me. But to me, that doesn't really prove anything, right? There could have been 3 George Bushes or 4 or 5, and the fact you found one that wasn't the George Bush of the memo, to me, doesn't really incriminate Bush enough to suit me. But so you got to get the big picture, and again, right, Tarpley's the best place to go if you want to get the big picture, see what that elephant looks like. And Tarpley will turn you on to the notion of skull and bones. And in this picture of skull and bones, the big guy up on the left is George Herbert Walker. The guy to Bush's right is Peabody Davison. The guy to his left is F. Truby Davison. Peabody was the son of F. Truby. F. Truby was the head of hiring for CIA, and George Bush is in Skull and Bones with the son of the head of hiring for CIA. Damn. Pretty hardcore. Prescott was in Skull and Bones. Averill Harriman was in Skull and Bones. This will come up, I hope, in a minute. Averill Harriman, E. Howard Hunt worked for Averill Harriman directly. Damn, and then went out on to kill presidents, to assassinate presidents. So, this is supposed to be an animation where he jumps on a pole and he goes from being in Skull and Bones with the son of the head of hiring for CIA, and he ends up working for a CIA recruiter. He immediately, that is his first stop, is working for Neil Mallon, who's a CIA recruiter. Now, I have a cute question for you. CIA recruiters don't advertise in the paper, do they? How the hell do you know this guy's a CIA recruiter? Because, come on, Prescott Bush said so. And I think we can take Prescott's word for it, don't you? He wrote a memo to the guy who runs Life magazine saying Neil Mallon is an old and dear friend and is a recruiter for the CIA, and my son went to work for him. And when he left working for Neil Mallon, the CIA recruiter, he set up operations right in the middle of CIA operations in the Caribbean in preparation for the Bay of Pigs invasion. I don't know what comes next. Oh, it's in my video, right, Dark Legacy and JFK 2, it says, you couldn't ask for better evidence, but you can get better evidence. This is a memo written by Neil Mallon to Allen Dulles saying, hey, let's get together with Prescott and talk about our plans for what the CIA is doing in the Caribbean. And, you know, there's his son setting up operations in the middle of the Caribbean. That's some pretty stern stuff. I had to throw this in as well. Right, I said, Prescott is really, I think, the Dark Lord of his sons. He is the major evil figure. As you saw a picture, I put it up before, that Prescott recruited Nixon to get into politics. Prescott worked for Harriman, and Hunt worked for Harriman. Hunt worked for Allen Dulles. Prescott and Dulles were close friends. They met. We have that letter. We just looked at it. Prescott worked at the bottom in the big picture. Prescott worked for Harriman, as did Richard Bissell. And Hunt worked for Richard Bissell. So you have 4 major league connections between Prescott Bush and E. Howard Hunt. You know, there's much, much, much more to talk about Prescott. There's evidence that Prescott Bush outranked Allen Dulles. Prescott Bush met daily with Eisenhower. Why? To play golf. That's the answer to that question. I got to tell the story because I can tell it fairly quickly. Joseph Trento is a really important source, and if you got a pen, write that one down. Joseph Trento has written some really, really important books on the CIA, and he likes the CIA, and he's got friends in the CIA, and they talk to him, and he reports it, but he hates the Bushes. He likes the CIA. He thinks they're an important organization providing a really important service for the United States, but he hates the Bushes. Joseph Trento. Anyhow, Trento tells the story about some guy telling him how he got a call from they had just tried to kill Zhou Enlai in China, and the operation went bad, and some people got killed, and this guy's got shot, and he's lying in a hospital, and his boss calls him up, the guy who, you know, organized the operation, and he said, you're going to get an interview from a very, very high-ranking individual. Talk to him. Be frank with him. Tell him everything, and don't talk to anybody else. And so Prescott Bush shows up, and the guy says, oh, I didn't know you were in the CIA. Oh no, it'll come right back. There it is. It'll come right back. I just have to change slides. And Prescott interviews him. The guy says Prescott interviews him and does it like, you know, he's very, very competent. He knows what he's talking about. And then he says, have you had any problems? And the guy says, well, yeah. Allen Dulles was furious when he called me up and asked me what was going on, and I told him he didn't have clearance. So, and if you think about it for 2 seconds, right, if I'm the CIA, I'm going to tell you who the head of the CIA is? Hell no. I'm going to put some guy out there and say, this is the head of the CIA. He ain't the head of the CIA. So he can get called into the Senate, and he can get questioned, and he can tell he can tell everything he knows, which is nothing. Right? They can question him all he wants, and they can give him a lie detector test. Oh, I don't know anything about that. The CIA wasn't involved in that, to my knowledge. Right? Yeah, because your knowledge is practically non-existent. We did that. Okay, yeah, so we're going to revisit this stuff about being humble and being skeptical of your own position. I mean, this is a lesson I try to take, and I would certainly welcome everybody to do the same thing. Be tolerant and patient of the other good people who are out there trying to do this work. Be kind and polite to them. We're all trying to read the shadows on the wall, and you can't really read the shadows on the wall. You can try. But, you know, to me, it's very, very much like what scientists do. And, you know, they get some reading from Mars, and everybody looks at it and says, geez, what the hell does that mean? Oh, I don't know. And so somebody comes up with a suggestion, oh, maybe it means this. And somebody else says, oh, it can't mean that because of this, that, and the other. And they have that sort of collegial discussion, hopefully on a friendly basis, and help each other see the weaknesses in the positions that they took so that they can clear them up. Jim DiEugenio oh man, said such horrible things about what a stupid and worthless piece of dog excrement I am for doing the work that I have done. And the major thing that he, but, you know, I wish he had been nicer about it. But I'm delighted that he did it. You know, and if I have to take a load of crap from somebody so that they can really hand me what this guy, or push me in the direction that this guy pushed me, it's way more than, you know, I'd write him a thank you note and shake his hand today if I had the opportunity. He says, oh man, this stuff about Bush and his planes, that's just stupid garbage. It's worthless. You shouldn't talk about it. Of course, he didn't talk about the Hoover memo. He left that out, but never mind. And the stuff about the name of Bush's oil company and the name of the operation, that's just silly and so on. But, you know, let's all remind ourselves you're supposed to be humble and polite and kind and patient and appreciative. Now, but he made me think about this. Man, that's a stupid story. He said it. This is, but, Jim, I got it from Mark Lane. You didn't call Mark Lane all those names when Mark Lane said it. And he got it from Fletcher Prouty. You didn't call Fletcher Prouty all those names when he said it. Well, I got that far, and then I said, wait a minute. So why the hell did Fletcher Prouty say it? Right? Mark Lane said it because Fletcher Prouty said it. How could Fletcher Prouty, such a powerful and responsible fellow, say that? Well, I'll tell you how. He was, as I mentioned before, he was the #2 guy at the Pentagon. He was probably the #1 guy at the Pentagon responsible for providing the CIA with war material. If they needed guns, he got them guns. If they needed howitzers, he got them howitzers. If they needed mines and submarines, if they needed submarines, he got them. Whatever it was that they needed, he got it for them. He's the guy who got the CIA the ships for the Bay of Pigs. He purchased them. He refurbished them. And while they were being refurbished, they had their names changed to the Barbara and the Houston. He gave the order to change the names to the Barbara and the Houston. Well, he knows where he got those names, but he can't say it because it would be classified and he would get arrested at least. If he was lucky, he would only get arrested. So he didn't say that. He gives this silly, screwy story that I have to get beat up over about how Bush's plane was named the Barbara, and his next plane was named the Barbara, and one of the ships at the Bay of Pigs was named the Barbara. Well, cut to the fact that if Prouty says the name came from Bush, he freaking knows because he's the one who gave the order. The story about how would he know about Zapata Offshore and Operation Zapata? Probably Bush told him in one of the many, many hours they spent working together on all of this stuff. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, Len Osanek is in that picture, and Len Osanek said, and he said it on Jim Fetzer's radio program, that when Prouty talks, he said what I just told you, that he can't say everything that he knows, so that he has to hint at it. And that's what he did with this story about the ships. Jim, that's what happened, and so, come on, there we go. It wasn't me who said it. I brought Jim up so I could say, hey, Jim, it wasn't me, it was Prouty. And Prouty knew what the hell he was doing, and Osanek says he could only give hints, and that's what he did. So, damn. You know, here we have J. Edgar Hoover, who, I should check my notes. Oh, no, you ain't heard nothing yet. J. Edgar Hoover, man, I'm sure J. Edgar Hoover knows so much because Oswald's an FBI. I don't want to say, if I say agent, there are people who are, oh, he wasn't an agent, he was an asset. Okay, he was an FBI asset, but he was reporting on all of this stuff. And Maria Lorenz says he was in the room when E. Howard Hunt came in, and so was Frank Sturgis and Jack Ruby when E. Howard Hunt came in and started passing out maps and money. So Oswald knew about that. The FBI published, that's the word. Hoover sent out a memo to every FBI station in the country a couple of days before the assassination saying there's going to be an attempt on the president in Dallas on November 22nd. And he writes a memo in which he names George Bush as, to me, the obvious conclusion, right? If you're talking about CIA Operation 40 and you give a report on what you found out to George Bush, well, you don't give a report to a guy who's not in charge of it. You call on the responsible parties. So that this memo indicates that. And Hoover knew that all of those people were in Dallas, right? He told Maria Lorenz, yeah, we know you guys were in Dallas. They told Sturgis, we know you guys were in Dallas. Where am I at? So, the point is that it couldn't not be true. There's no way this memo was about anybody but our George Bush, given all of this information. 10 minutes. Good. But you got to put stuff into context, and I think that that's a pretty good example. That when you put things into context, you can develop, you can get a perspective on things. Okay, good. Here's a piece of context for you. Hoover knew that the Bushes were Nazis. How did he know? Because in 1932 he busted Prescott Bush for being the CEO of Union Bank of New York, which was seized by the government as a Nazi asset. That should have put him in jail. Did it put him in jail? No, he went on to become a senator. Damn, that's juice, right? You got power. You were walking, you got magical shoes or something that the FBI can bust you for being a Nazi, and the next thing you know, you're a freaking senator picking the guy who you think is going to be the next president of the United States. That was the plan. I don't know why that's up there. Let's try the next one. Well, so, when Hoover writes a memo about Bush, Mr. George Bush of the CIA, he knows who he's talking about. Prescott Bush was a figure that was very, very familiar to him, and he knew when he wrote this memo that he was talking about the son of Prescott Bush. Now, here's one you may have missed. At 9 o'clock he wrote this memo. They called in Bush on the 23rd, the day after the assassination. You know what else they did the day after the assassination? At 9 o'clock in the morning, McCone, the head of the CIA, called up Johnson and said, "Hey, Johnson, Oswald was working for the Russians." Johnson says, "Okay, that's not good news. We hate this to turn into World War III." He hangs up the phone. It rings. Hoover picks it up. And this is from James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which I really, really highly recommend, except that it took me about 6 months of work to read it as many times as I needed to. Anyhow, Hoover calls him up at 9:40 and says, "The tapes that you got from the Central Intelligence Agency right, McCone says that Oswald was working for the Russians based on these tapes from the Central Intelligence Agency. They're forgeries. My guys have been talking, they've been interviewing Oswald for 12 hours, and they left the room interviewing Oswald and walked in and listened to the tapes, and they say that they're forgeries. In addition, just to corroborate that, Oswald was fluent in Russian, and the guy at the Cuban embassy pretending to be, or the guy on the tape, pretending to be Oswald was not fluent in Russian. That's not Oswald. The CIA, 2 months before the assassination, set Oswald up to appear to be a Russian agent." Hoover's telling Johnson, the CIA killed Kennedy at 9:40 in the morning on the 23rd. That's police work. I think, that's the reputation that the FBI used to when I was a kid. That was, yeah, of course, 9:40 in the morning, they know who did it. They've been at it all night. That's all from JFK and the Unspeakable. My point is that when Hoover wrote this memo, he knew that the CIA, when he says Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency, he's saying Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency that killed Kennedy, that set up Oswald, that framed him as a Russian agent. Mr. George Bush of that Central Intelligence Agency, we called him in on the 23rd to talk to him about Operation 40 and all of those operatives who we know were all in Dallas that day. All of them armed? I think so, probably. Where am I at? You're going to tell me when I got 5 minutes, yes? I got 5 minutes. Well, let's step on it because we've got a couple of pages left. So Bush was a member of that community of murderers. All right, that's enough. I mean, a community of murderers. And you have to, the Mafia, you make your bone. We talked about this, making your bone. Yes, you have to kill somebody. If you want to sit at that table, you have to kill somebody. And it's one of the bedrocks of Skull and Bones that you have to commit a crime. If you want to be a leading member of Skull and Bones, you have to commit a crime. I wish I was making that up. This is the Parrott memo that I talked about, so let's skip it. You saw that before. Ooh, you're going to see it again because Roger Craig, let's go back. Roger Craig, American Association of Oil Drilling Contractors. Roger Craig is Jim Garrison's favorite deputy sheriff. When the Dallas police fired him for telling the truth about any number of things, including the fact that they found a Mauser in the school book depository and not a Mannlicher Carcano, he became Garrison's favorite detective. Garrison hired him, and Garrison is trying to get the arrest records from the Dallas police. He figures, Garrison says, the Dallas police weren't incompetent. They probably arrested a bunch of guys who were involved in the assassination. Give me the arrest records. I want the photographs and the fingerprints and whatever else you got on them, because those guys that were probably, the Dallas police are not incompetent. They weren't arresting hobos that day. They were arresting guys who were suspects in the murder of the president. And they gave him nothing. They gave him one thing, which is a guy named James Brading, who was an independent oil contractor from Beverly Hills, who ran, and says Garrison, ran into the Taltex building trying to get arrested. And Garrison looks at that and says, that's garbage. This is crap. This is stuff that you set up. This is set up. So he tells Craig, go talk to your friends. They won't give me the paperwork. Talk to your friends and ask them who got arrested. All right, Garrison tells him that. And he says, there you go. This is from Ratville. You can find it easily enough. This is an article that he wrote. I told him, Garrison, that I knew of 12 arrests, in particular one made by R.E. Vaughn of the Dallas Police Department. The man Vaughn arrested was coming from the Daltex building across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. The only thing which Vaughn knew about him was that he was an independent oil operator from Houston. Well, what's an independent oil operator? Another name for him is a contractor, right? He doesn't work for the company. He works as a contractor for the company because he's independent. And I'm going to skip this. Except that the point is, the crowd was jeering. The crowd arrested Bush when he came running out. The crowd handed him over to Vaughn, and they jeered as they left, and they jeered as he was released and put in the back of a police car. All right. Well, so do I need to make that point? A contractor is an independent oil operator. Bush was in the middle. Oh, I'm sorry. We know a bunch of people who were in Operation 40. Frank Sturgis was in Operation 40. Was he an independent oil operator? He wasn't. Hunt, he was in Operation 40. And on and on and on. Bosch and Lorenz and on and on and on. None of them were independent oil operators. There was one member of Operation 40 who was an independent oil operator, and that independent oil operator, and that was Bush. Okay. And, I mean, that's him. That's the guy. Now, Jim says, man, he wouldn't have been a shooter. A bullet hit the sidewalk. Man, he missed by 50 feet. A bullet hit James Tague down the street. A bullet hit the curb. Somebody shooting at Bush from behind was a terrible shot. They hit the aluminum strip or the metal strip going above the windshield. They put one through the windshield. Somebody firing from behind was a terrible shot. Was Bush the shooter? Who cares? Does it matter? I kind of think that it doesn't. We have all of this information connecting his father to the assassination, but I'm supposed to, some here say, wait a minute, wait. Prescott is this big-time guy, and he pushes his son to be so in the front lines that he gets named by Hoover. He gets arrested as a shooter, and he gets named by, you do that to your children? Right, you're doing all of this. The FBI was all over that. Oswald was their guy. And you do that to your children, you force them, and your grandchildren, right? If your son goes to jail, what happens to his grandchild? Because that's how you get a seat at the table. Well, that's my interpretation of the shadows, and it's a shadowy interpretation, but that's how you get your seat.